The day my father erased me from his empire, he didn't even look me in the eyes. The boardroom was colder than usual that morning. 24 floors above the city, surrounded by glass walls and polished steel, I stood at the head of the table. The same table where I had spent years proving I was worthy. And then he said it. With immediate effect, ownership of the company transfers to my wife. Not to his daughter. Not to the girl who built half the overseas branches. Not to the one who skipped birthdays. Friendships, sleep, just to protect his name. To her. A woman who had been in our lives for barely 2 years. Her red lipstick curved into a quiet victory. Smile as the lawyers slid documents across the table. My name wasn't on a single page. I felt something crack inside my chest, but I didn't cry. Because I knew something they didn't. Years ago, when I was barely 18, my father made me sign something. He called it a precaution, said it was for tax structuring, said I didn't need to understand it. But I remembered every word. And that contract? It was never destroyed. While they celebrated my removal, while she planned her new reign, while my father convinced himself he had secured his legacy, I was already making one call. They thought they had buried me. They had no idea they had just triggered a clause that would burn everything down. This wasn't the day I lost my empire. This was the day they signed their own downfall. And my name? It was still written where it mattered most. The day he chose her over me. I always knew my father was capable of being ruthless. I just never imagined I would be the target. The boardroom smelled like polished wood and betrayal that morning. 24 floors above the city, sunlight streamed through the glass walls, making everything look powerful, untouchable, permanent. Just like I thought our legacy was, I stood at the head of the table, reviewing quarterly projections I had personally negotiated. The Asia merger was stabilizing. European expansion was finally profitable. The empire was stronger than it had ever been. I built that strength. Not alone, but I carried it when my father couldn't. After my mother passed away, I became more than a daughter. I became his partner, his shield, his proof that he had built something lasting. He used to introduce me proudly. "This is Maria," he would say. "My greatest investment." I believed that meant something. Until the doors opened. My father walked in, slower than usual. Not weak, just distant. Behind him was Isabella, elegant as ever in a cream silk suit, red lipstick perfectly applied, eyes calm like someone who already knew the ending of the story. The room shifted. Executives straightened. Lawyers sat alert. Something wasn't right. My father didn't take his usual seat beside me. He sat at the opposite end of the table, across from me. That was the first sign. "Let's begin," he said, voice formal, cold. A lawyer I didn't recognize stood and began distributing folders. Thick ones. Official ones. One stopped in front of me. I opened it, and the air left my lungs. Transfer of majority ownership. Effective immediately. All controlling shares reassigned. To Isabella Laurent? I didn't react at first. I read it again. Then again. "This isn't finalized," I said calmly. "This needs board approval." "It has board approval," Isabella replied softly. Her voice was gentle. Victorious. I looked around the room. Every single board member avoided my eyes. They had already voted. Without me. My father folded his hands together. "This is a strategic restructuring." Strategic. That word felt like poison. "I expanded 3 international divisions," I said quietly. "I secured the Bahrain investors when the company was bleeding. I negotiated the tech acquisition you said was impossible. And we appreciate that," he interrupted. Not I. But leadership requires stability," he continued. "And experience." I felt something inside me harden. "I've been running half this company since I was 19. "You've been assisting," Isabella corrected. Assisting. The word echoed in my skull like an insult carved into stone. My father didn't defend me. That was the second sign. "This is temporary, Maria," he said. "You'll retain a senior executive role. A role in the empire that carries my blood. My name might not be on the building, but my work was in every corner of it." I remembered the nights I slept in my office during acquisitions, the deals I closed while running on caffeine and grief, the interviews where I smiled through exhaustion because our stock price depended on confidence. I gave this company my 20s, and now I was being offered a desk. "I see," I said. And I did. This wasn't business. This was replacement. Isabella had been patient, calculated. For 2 years she watched, Learned, planted influence quietly. Board dinners. Private conversations. Strategic charity appearances beside my father. She didn't take power. She absorbed it. And my father let her. Sign the acknowledgement, the lawyer said gently. I looked down at the page. Acknowledgement of ownership transition. They wanted my signature to make it clean, to make it look unified, to erase resistance. I closed the folder slowly. No. Silence fell like a blade. This isn't a negotiation, my father warned. No, I agreed softly. It isn't. Because something had just shifted inside me. Not heartbreak. Not even anger. Clarity. I stood up. For a moment, I saw hesitation flicker across his face. Maybe he expected tears. A scene, a breakdown. He doesn't know me at all. Congratulations, I said, looking directly at Isabella. Her smile widened just slightly. Predator satisfied. I turned toward the door. Maria, my father called. I paused. But I didn't turn around. You're making this harder than it needs to be. No. He already made it as hard as it could possibly be. I walked out of the boardroom with my spine straight and my heartbeat steady. The elevator ride down felt longer than usual. The mirrored walls reflected a version of me that looked composed. But inside, something sacred had shattered. When the doors opened into the lobby, employees greeted me with respect as always. They didn't know. Not yet. Outside, the city roared like nothing had changed. But everything had. I stepped into my car and closed the door. And finally, I allowed myself one slow breath. I replayed the moment in my head. The confidence in Isabella's eyes. The certainty in my father's voice. They believed this was over. They believed they had secured the empire. But they forgot something important. 5 years ago, when I turned 18, my father insisted I sign a legal protective structure agreement. He said it was tax optimization, asset shielding, standard corporate precaution. I signed it without questioning him. But I remember one thing clearly. He made me sign as a primary stakeholder, and he signed beneath me. At the time, I didn't understand the weight of that detail. Now, it felt heavy, important, dangerous. I pulled out my phone, scrolled through old contacts, and stopped at a name I hadn't spoken to in years. Mr. Bennett, my father's former legal advisor, the man who drafted that agreement. My finger hovered for a second. Then I pressed call. He answered on the third ring. Maria? His voice sounded cautious. I need to ask you something, I said, staring at the company building through my windshield. The agreement my father had me sign when I turned 18? Do you still have the original copy? Silence. Long. Measured. Yes, he finally replied. My pulse slowed. Good, I whispered. Because if that contract says what I think it says, then today wasn't the day I lost everything. It was the day they triggered something irreversible. I ended the call, started the engine, and drove away from the empire that thought it had buried me. They took my title, they took my shares, they took my seat at the table. But they forgot one rule my father taught me himself. Never sign a document you don't fully control. And 5 years ago, he made a mistake. The contract they thought was harmless. I didn't go home that day. I went straight to the one place my father would never expect me to go. Mr. Bennett's private office. It wasn't inside some shining corporate tower. It was in an older building downtown, the kind with marble floors worn down by decades of secrets. The kind of place where powerful men hide their contingencies. He was already waiting when I arrived. Older, grayer, but his eyes were still sharp. You look like your mother, he said quietly as I sat across from him. I hope I fight like her too, I replied. He didn't smile. Instead, he reached into a locked drawer and pulled out a thick, sealed envelope. My name was written across the front in my father's handwriting. Maria Laurent. Seeing it made my chest tighten. He made me draft this the week you turned 18, Mr. Bennett said. He was very specific. Specific how? He didn't trust the future. That sounded like him. Always planning 10 moves ahead? But apparently, not far enough. Mr. Bennett slid the envelope toward me. Before you open that, he continued carefully, you need to understand something. Your father structured the empire through layered holding companies. On paper, he controls the assets. I know that. But this agreement, he said, tapping the envelope, isn't about paper control. My pulse quickened. I opened it. The pages were thick, official, stamped. Clause 7A. I remembered that number. Back then, I had skimmed past it. Now I read every word slowly. And with each line, the silence in the room grew heavier. The agreement named me as foundational equity anchor at 18, which meant every major asset transfer required my signed consent. Any restructuring without my authorization triggered automatic reversion rights. Reversion. I swallowed. Explain it to me, I said, even though I already understood. Mr. Bennett leaned back. If your father transferred controlling shares without your signed approval, the entire restructuring is legally void. The world seemed to still void. As in reversed? I asked. As in undone, he replied calmly. My fingers tightened around the paper. Why would he draft something like this? Because at the time, Mr. Bennett said carefully, he wanted to protect the company from outside influence. Outside influence. Wives. New alliances. Unknown variables. Irony tastes bitter when it circles back. He structured it so that you could never be removed without your consent. You were the safeguard. A hollow laugh escaped me. The safeguard he just tried to eliminate? There's more, Mr. Bennett added. My heart didn't need more. But there was more. Clause 9C, if any attempt was made to bypass the foundational equity anchor through concealed board manipulation or undisclosed voting procedures, the anchor gains temporary executive override power pending judicial review. Executive override. My father hadn't just made me untouchable. He had made me powerful. I looked up slowly. He forgot, I said. No, Mr. Bennett corrected gently. He assumed loyalty. That hurt more than betrayal. He assumed I would never use it against him. He assumed I would accept anything he did. He assumed I would remain his obedient daughter. He forgot I grew up inside boardrooms. I closed the folder carefully. When was the last time this was referenced legally? I asked. Never, Mr. Bennett said. It was dormant, silent, waiting. Waiting. Just like Isabella had waited. The difference? Mine was written in ink. Hers was written in influence. If we activate this, Mr. Bennett said cautiously, it will cause a war. It's already war, I replied. He studied me carefully. You understand what this means for your father? Yes. And Isabella? I held his gaze. She chose the battlefield. Silence settled between us. Not heavy, just inevitable. What's the process? I asked. Mr. Bennett stood and walked toward the window, hands clasped behind his back. We file a notice of contractual breach. The moment it's delivered, the share transfer freezes. Publicly, internally first. But it will leak. Of course it would. Corporate blood always does. And once it's frozen, board authority suspends pending investigation. And Isabella? I asked. She loses controlling power immediately. For the first time since that morning, I felt something steady inside me. Not revenge. Balance. They removed me in a single meeting. Now they would feel what instability truly looks like. I gathered the documents and stood. When do we file? Mr. Bennett checked his watch. If we move fast, tomorrow morning. Tomorrow. Less than 24 hours after they erased me. Perfect. I walked toward the door, then paused. One more thing, I said quietly. Does he know? Mr. Bennett didn't hesitate. No. Good. Let him feel surprise for once. As I stepped outside into the cool evening air, my phone buzzed. Isabella. I stared at her name lighting up my screen. Decline. Seconds later, my father. I answered that one. Maria, he said, voice strained. You left without speaking to me. There wasn't much left to say. You're overreacting. The audacity. Am I? I asked softly. You still have a place in the company. A place. Like a guest. You made your decision, I replied calmly. Stand by it. There was silence. Then something unexpected in his tone. Uncertainty. Maria, don't do anything impulsive. Impulsive. He still thought I was emotional. Still thought I was reacting. He had no idea I was executing. Good night, Father, I said. And I ended the call. Back in my car, I placed the contract carefully in the passenger seat. For 5 years, it sat untouched. For 5 years, it waited quietly. And tomorrow, it would speak louder than any board vote ever could. Isabella believed she had won because she held the shares. My father believed he was untouchable because he signed the documents. But power isn't about signatures. It's about structure. And he built a structure that answers to me. As I drove into the city lights, one thought echoed steadily in my mind. They didn't just betray me. They activated me. Tomorrow morning, Aurora Holdings would wake up to something unexpected. Not a scandal. Not a rumor. A clause. And clauses don't scream. They dismantle. At exactly 8:47 a.m., the notice was delivered. Not by email. Not by messenger. By courier, hand-delivered, signed, stamped, legally undeniable. I wasn't inside the building when it happened. I was across the street, sitting in the back of a black town car, watching through tinted windows as executives rushed in with their morning coffees and confident smiles, completely unaware their stability had just expired. Mr. Bennett had moved quickly. Notice of contractual breach. Activation of Clause 7A and 9C. Immediate freeze of controlling share transfer. By 9:03 a.m., my phone buzzed. One message. Transfer suspended. Board emergency session called. I exhaled slowly. The first crack had formed. Inside Aurora Holdings, panic travels faster than ambition. At 9:15 a.m., Isabella's assistant called me. I didn't answer. At 9:19 a.m., my father called. I let it ring once. Twice. Then I answered. What did you do? His voice was sharp now. Not calm, not controlled. I enforced a contract, I replied evenly. You're jeopardizing the company. No, I said softly. You did that when you ignored the agreement you made me sign. Silence. He remembered. I could hear it. You wouldn't dare, he muttered. I didn't dare, I corrected. I executed. He hung up. That told me everything. At 10 a.m., the emergency board meeting began. This time I was invited. Not as a daughter, not as a sidelined executive, but as foundational equity anchor. The title sounded almost theatrical, but legally, it was lethal. When I walked into the boardroom, the energy had changed. Yesterday, I was dismissed. Today, they stood when I entered. Power doesn't shout. It shifts gravity. My father sat at the head of the table, tension carved into his face. Isabella sat beside him, but her posture was different now. Less relaxed. Less victorious. She didn't smile. Good. Mr. Bennett spoke first, outlining the contractual breach. His voice was calm, clinical, devastating. The restructuring, enacted yesterday, lacks required authorization from the foundational equity anchor, he concluded. Under Clause 7A, the transfer is legally void pending judicial review. Murmurs spread across the table. Investors hate instability. And right now, Isabella represented instability. This is absurd, she said, breaking her silence. The board voted. The board cannot override foundational structure. Mr. Bennett replied smoothly. All eyes turned to me. I didn't rush. I didn't gloat. I simply opened the original agreement and placed it on the table. The sound of paper sliding across polished wood echoed louder than any accusation. My father designed this structure himself, I said calmly, to protect the company from external influence. I let the words linger. External. Influence. Isabella's jaw tightened. You're attacking me personally, she snapped. No, I said, meeting her gaze directly. I'm protecting what I built. That hit harder. Because everyone in that room knew it was true. The Asia expansion, mine. The tech acquisition, mine. The investor recovery strategy, mine. She had married into power. I had earned it. My father finally spoke. What do you want, Maria? The question was layered. What do you want as a daughter? What do you want as a rival? What do you want as a threat? I held his eyes. I want the company restored to its original governance structure until proper review is completed. And after review? Isabella pressed. I tilted my head slightly. That depends on what else I discover. Silence. Fear is subtle in corporate rooms. It hides behind folded hands and tightened smiles. But it was there. Because if they overlooked this clause, what else had they overlooked? By 11:30 a.m., the decision was made. Transfer suspended. Isabella's controlling authority revoked temporarily. Executive oversight reassigned to me, not permanently. But officially, the irony was almost poetic. Yesterday, I was offered a comfortable position. Today, I had override power. As the meeting ended, Isabella leaned toward me slightly. You think this makes you powerful? She whispered. I stood slowly. No, I replied quietly. This makes me protected. There's a difference. Power can be taken. Protection must be dismantled. And dismantling me was going to cost them far more than they expected. As I walked out of the boardroom, phones were already buzzing. Legal teams scrambling, Investors requesting clarification. The empire wasn't collapsing, but it was trembling. And tremors expose weak foundations. In the elevator, I caught my reflection again. Not hurt. Not shaken. Awake. They tried to erase me in one meeting. Now they would spend months untangling what they triggered. But deep down, I knew this wasn't over, because Isabella hadn't married my father for a temporary title. And my father hadn't built an empire to lose control. They would retaliate. The only question was how. And I was ready. Power doesn't collapse loudly. It cracks quietly, then shatters all at once. For 2 weeks, the empire stood on fragile ground. Legally, I had executive oversight. Publicly, my father called it temporary restructuring. Privately, Isabella was hunting for a way to destroy me. And she almost did. Almost. It started with a leak. An anonymous report sent to financial regulators claiming, I manipulated overseas expansion numbers. The accusation was detailed, precise, designed to stain credibility, not just mine, but the company's. It was clever. Too clever. Because whoever drafted it had inside knowledge of internal reporting structures. Inside knowledge that only a few people had access to. My father, the CFO, and Isabella. I didn't react publicly. I did what she never expected. I audited everything. Quietly. Forensic accountants. Independent analysts. Old acquisition files reopened. Every international transaction reviewed line by line. And that's when I found it. Not in my division. In hers. 6 months before the attempted takeover, a shell consulting firm began receiving strategic advisory fees from one of our subsidiary accounts. The firm had no employees, no office, no deliverables. But it had a director, Isabella's brother. The payments weren't massive individually, but together, 8 figures. She hadn't just married into power. She had been siphoning from it. I stared at the documents in silence. Not angry, not shocked. Just certain. This wasn't about love. This wasn't about stability. This was about extraction. The emergency board meeting that followed felt different from the last one. This time, I wasn't defending my position. I was presenting evidence. The room was still as I projected the payment trail onto the screen. Dates, transfers, corporate linkages, and then the final slide. Ownership records tying the shell company to Isabella's immediate family. My father's face drained of color. Isabella didn't look at me. She looked at him. This is a misunderstanding, she said smoothly. Standard consulting practice. For a company with no employees? I asked quietly. Silence answered. The CFO cleared his throat. These transactions were approved under executive privilege, he said carefully. Executive privilege? Granted to Isabella after the transfer. The very transfer that had violated the contract. Irony is merciless. You tried to accuse me of manipulation, I said calmly, while redirecting company funds into your own network. Her composure finally cracked. You're trying to humiliate me, she snapped. No, I replied. I'm correcting the narrative. The board didn't need emotion. They needed liability assessment. And liability was sitting beside my father in a cream silk suit. By the end of the meeting, the decision was unanimous. Full internal investigation. Immediate suspension of Isabella's financial authority. Referral to regulatory review. She stood abruptly. You think this makes you untouchable? She hissed at me as she gathered her bag. I met her eyes steadily. No, I said. It makes me informed. Security escorted her out of the building she thought she owned. And for the first time since this began, I looked at my father. Not as a rival, not as a wounded daughter, but as a man who had miscalculated. You built safeguards for a reason, I told him quietly after the room cleared. You just forgot why. His shoulders seemed heavier than I'd ever seen them. I never thought you would use it against me, he admitted. I didn't, I said softly. I used it to protect what you taught me to build. That was the truth. This was never about revenge. It was about restoration. Weeks later, the investigation concluded. Funds were recovered. Charges were negotiated quietly. Isabella disappeared from corporate records and from our lives. The contract remained intact, but something else changed. My father stepped back from daily operations, not forced. Voluntarily. For the first time, he let the empire breathe without controlling it. And me? At 24, I became the official CEO of the company I had almost lost. Not because I fought dirty, but because I remembered the rules he wrote. The old contract didn't just surface. It revealed character. His, hers, and mine. They tried to hand my billion-dollar empire to someone who didn't build it. They tried to erase my name from the legacy. But ink doesn't disappear just because someone signs over shares. Sometimes the most powerful weapon isn't revenge. It's preparation. And sometimes the girl they underestimate is the one holding the original contract. If you felt Maria's strength, if you believe in quiet power over loud betrayal, please subscribe my channel.